that lie ahead. You can follow the conversation on Twitter today at Press Club of Australia or using the hashtag NRPC for the National Rural Press Club. Please join me in welcoming Andrew McConville.
Thanks very much, Kath, and good afternoon, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, and we respect and acknowledge their connection to this land. I pay my respects to Ngunnawal elders past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge and pay my respects to First Nations people throughout the Murray-Darling Basin who have a deep connection to lands and waters, as well as First Nations people here today and those who may be watching across Australia. There are around 40 First Nations across the basin, and we strive to maintain a strong and resilient partnership with all First Nations people. We all can and we must do better. 3 weeks ago, I spent some time with the Ngarrindjeri people down on the Coorong. It was a real privilege to be with them. Their deep identification with their country is something to behold. It holds their family, it holds their history, and it holds their culture. And such a connection with country embraces everyone who walks upon their land. And it also holds the pain of the past and the promise of the future in equal measure. Our thoughts today also are with those communities and businesses impacted by flooding, which for many must seem absolutely unrelenting. Like many of you, I saw the horrifying story of the family from Eugowra clinging to a tree while the floodwaters raged all around them. For 4 hours they waited, hoping rescuers could see them from the helicopters above. Can you just imagine what that was like? And what's even more terrifying is that the water seemed to come from nowhere, quickly engulfing their car. It's been described as an inland tsunami. And then for other communities like Echuca and Shepparton, their experience of flooding is full of uncertainties, of what-ifs, as they waited for the inevitable floodwaters to arrive. And the impact of floods like this is really brutal. Tragically, lives have been lost, livelihoods have been destroyed. Supply chains to markets have been broken, bridges and roads washed away. Local governments estimate $2.5 billion of damage to roads. We've seen devastating images of the impacts of blackwater on our native fish. And the damage to the built and the natural environment is captured in the headlines and the drone footage widely seen on social media. It's really visible and front of mind. But the horrendous clean-up and the recovery takes a significant toll, and unfortunately there aren't many cameras rolling then. And what's invisible also is the social impacts, that normal life is gone within minutes and it strains relationships for years. These communities have really copped a gutful. Places like Gunnedah, where I had my first job out of university, have been flooded 7 times in 12 months. These communities, they lean on each other and they lean in with each other. They support each other, and of course in time they will rebuild their lives together. And so our thoughts are with all of them suffering right now. And I think it's really important to also acknowledge the tremendous job of our emergency services who've been absolutely doing their best under pretty terrible circumstances. The extremes of our climate are on display, our increasingly variable climate are on display right now, and devastatingly so. Daily inflows to the Murray River system for November are 7 times the long-term average. Rainfall was the highest on record for October in many parts of the basin, in Queensland, in New South Wales and in Victoria. And as sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, we know that the next drought is not far away. 10 years ago today, as Kath mentioned, then Water Minister Tony Burke stood in this room and announced that the Basin Plan had been signed into law. In his speech, Minister Burke said, "Today is the day that Australia decided to restore the Murray-Darling to health. Today is the day that Australia decided that basin communities were every bit as important as they know they are, and Australia has recognised that. And Australia has made sure that we will lead the world in making sure that our environmental assets are used sustainably while also being used productively." It's a pretty timely reminder about why we have a basin plan and why it needs to be delivered in full. Throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, water gives life to us all. Most likely the food on your plate or the wine in your glass has come from an irrigated farm or vineyard from somewhere in the basin. Water delivers an ecosystem for plants and animals and fish. It underscores the history and the culture of First Nations people. It's home to 16 internationally significant wetlands, 35 endangered species and 120 types of water birds. More than 2.3 million people live in the basin. And the basin's rivers and groundwater networks support an agricultural sector worth $22 billion a year. Our rivers and our wetlands attract visitors from all around the world, and tourism delivers around $11 billion to the basin economy each year. The Murray-Darling Basin truly is an economic and an ecological powerhouse. So many values, so many perspectives, so much at stake. But managing water is not, and it cannot be, about one community, one sector, one industry, or one perspective. It's about balance, and that's why we have the Basin Plan. Come January next year, I'll have been working for 30 years, and it'll mark around six months in the job as Chief Executive of the MDBA. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a river operator, I'm not an engineer. Until recently, I wasn't even a public servant. But what drives me is bringing people together, building a shared understanding and a vision, and getting balanced outcomes. I've spent much of my working life trying to find a balance between environmental and agricultural needs, between the needs of government and the community in all of its forms. My passion and my empathy for rural and regional Australia stretches right back to my youth. I was born about 30 miles out of Scone in the Hunter Valley. My dad, a young man from Orange, was the only teacher at Isis River Public School, teaching 20 kids from prep to grade 6 in a weatherboard, one-room school with a tennis court out the front, a set of monkey bars and the Isis River out the back. And across the river lived my mum. She was nursing the ageing property owner, Mr Payne. In '71, we moved to Armidale in northern New South Wales, where my dad taught at the Armidale School, and over time my mum became the librarian. 52 years later, we're still connected to Armidale. My sister lives there, my nephew goes to uni there. And rural Australia is in my bones. And growing up in the country, all of my friends were from farms. So I had the privilege every school and university holidays to go and work on the land with these friends. I chipped and sprayed burrs, I mustered cattle, I helped irrigate cotton through the night. I've fished on the Darling, I've swum in the Namoy, and I've water skied on Keepit and Copeton. And I've camped and played pretty much from the Channel Country to the Coorong. And building a career mostly in agriculture, but with a few other unique experiences thrown in, I've lived in Queensland, in rural New South Wales, in country Victoria and in South Australia. And I've seen the majesty of booms and the agony of busts. And without knowing it at the time, I think those experiences have anchored me to rural and regional Australia in a way that shaped what matters to me most. So if we fast forward to today, water management is the singularly most complex thing I have ever had to get my head around. You have local governments and state governments who are advocating in the best interests of their region and their state. You have the Commonwealth taking a basin-wide view in the best interests of the nation. And you have a range of communities and interest groups all wanting to be heard. And of course, all should be heard. Against this backdrop is the Murray and Darling rivers, flowing thousands of kilometres across what is basically a flat and mostly dry plain. The elevation of the Darling River is just 100 metres at its source, and the river flows for nearly 1,500 kilometres to join the Murray at Wentworth. That's a fall of just 1 metre for every 15 kilometres. There are around 20 major rivers in the basin and more than 30 major dams or reservoirs, and they store about 22,000 gigalitres of water. There are multiple groundwater basins and flows. And then you have the variables. You've got rainfall variability, geological variability, agricultural variability, ecological variability, socioeconomic variability, and of course, politics. The basin's constituency is represented by 11 Houses of Parliament and more than 800 politicians. There is 980 pages of Commonwealth legislation alone, and then water legislation in every state. I mean, seriously, how hard do we want to make this? The Basin Plan came about during one of the worst droughts on record. The Millennium Drought shook us all. I was living in Horsham in the early days of the drought, and I had cracks in my front garden that you could easily lose a 2-metre broom handle in. According to the Bureau of Meteorology, inflows to the Murray River fell to their lowest on record, and it was only irrigation releases that kept the river flowing. There was no water set aside for critical human needs or for the environment. There was, in short, no safety net. And the Millennium Drought devastated communities, industries and First Nations people. It led to heavy water use restrictions in capital cities. It disconnected wetlands, exposed acid sulphate soils and reduced water allocations to zero for many irrigators. The Basin Plan came about because as a nation we agreed that enough was enough. The needs of the whole took precedence over the needs of one state, one interest group or one community. It was a national tragedy that hit all Australians to their core, and something needed to change. During the past couple of decades, we've had two serious droughts, the Millennium Drought from 97 to 09 and the very serious drought across the basin from 2017 to 19. And we've seen fish deaths and we've seen flooding. And over the life of the Basin Plan, we've seen 4 federal elections and 20 state and territory elections. There's been more than 10 separate inquiries into the Basin Plan by the Australian Parliament. There have been 2 statutory assessments of progress and more than 70 independent reports, as well as numerous state-based inquiries. And 10 years later, the Basin Plan still persists. I've travelled fairly extensively since joining the authority, and I got a map in my office. And each time I visit a new place in the basin, as part of my role, I mark it with a red dot. So far, I've got 36 dots. And being truly heard is one of the main themes of the conversations I have with everyone I meet. The other message I hear is that everyone wants a healthy river system. And of course, people have different views about what this looks like, and those views can differ vastly depending on who you are and indeed where you are. But everyone shares a passion for the health of our rivers, and importantly, no one I have come across wants to do away with the plan. Hand on heart, no one has said, throw it out. I struggle to think of anywhere else in the world where there's been such an extraordinary political agreement delivered. In Central Asia, the Amu Darya River, which once supported agriculture for thousands of years, is dying, and it's impacting millions of people in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. The Aral Sea, a freshwater sea into which the river used to flow, is almost dry. Put simply, water isn't being shared between users and the environment, and climate change is making it worse. In the United States, the Colorado River, which is a close cousin of the Murray-Darling because it flows through several states across an arid landscape, continues to suffer because of drought and competing upstream and downstream needs. No one is interested, indeed or willing, to come together for the benefit of the river and its communities. The Colorado hasn't reached the Pacific Ocean through Mexico in more than 60 years. An environmental pulse flow did connect it briefly for a short while in 2014. And so, against this international background, you can start to see just how remarkable the Basin Plan is. A plan in place on the driest inhabited continent on Earth. And what's often forgotten, I think, in the national conversation is the Basin Plan is a long-term, world-leading environmental reform. Over 100 years without a plan or a purpose, we took too much water from our rivers. Turning around 100 years of overconsumption doesn't happen quickly. But today we want our quick fixes, like the gratification of likes on TikTok, and nothing could be truer than the expectation placed on the Basin Plan. And turning around the decline of the health in our rivers and our wetlands and our floodplains takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. Importantly, we have seen improvements, and I'll touch on those in a moment. But first, I think we must reflect on the fact that this change has come at a cost to our irrigation-dependent communities. Make no mistake, they have done the heavy lifting. And on this, the 10-year anniversary of the Basin Plan, all Australians need to stop and think about that. Some communities have lost out because of the plan. Others have thrived. And the lessons from the various approaches to water recovery and their flow-on impacts to community must be considered by governments in any future decisions. Recently, we published a report on the social and economic conditions experienced by people living across the basin. It focuses on community wellbeing and provides us with a baseline from which to monitor changing conditions over time. It found that over the past decade, at a basin scale, gross regional product, local jobs and population have all increased. Community views on personal and community wellbeing in the basin reached a 5-year high in 2020, noting, of course, that there are some towns doing it tough. The pace of change in rural and regional Australia is rapid, and there are a lot of factors at play. The value of irrigation dropped in 1920 to $6.3 billion during the drought, following a high of nearly $9 billion in 2017-18. New data from the ABS shows that we've rebounded last financial year to around $8.4 billion. And despite the interruption caused by COVID, over the longer term, tourism in the basin has grown. However, First Nations employment rates across the basin are much lower than non-Indigenous employment rates, and water ownership by Indigenous entities is low and has decreased in recent years. We can and we must do better to support First Nations across the basin. The report gives us an overview, a vital picture, even though not all economic and social economic measures are covered. But governments can't make crucial decisions that might impact the lives and livelihoods of basin communities unless we understand community wellbeing and the state of the basin economy. We must learn the lessons of the past, and so we'll continue to monitor social and economic conditions, and we'll share our findings when more data becomes available. The Socioeconomic report's useful because it broadly covers the period of the Basin Plan. Now, not all the data sets go back the full 10 years of the Basin Plan, but many do, and you can see the trends over time. The Basin Plan is neither responsible for all of the upturns, nor is it responsible for all of the downturns. Rather, the report helps us understand what's happening in a very, very complex operating environment. Through the Basin Plan, water is now set aside for critical human water needs. Water for towns and cities is now prioritised in dry times. This didn't exist in the Millennium Drought. There's been significant government investment to make every drop count, on-farm and off-farm, modern, clever irrigation networks, smart water meters and precision watering on-farm. Certainly a far cry from the Deathridge wheels of old when I used to go out to farms in the west of New South Wales. And the basin's irrigators, who are amongst the most innovative in the world, have been at the forefront of this transition. We've also seen limits on water extraction put in place for all catchments across the basin, and the MDBA and the Inspector General of Water Compliance have been monitoring compliance within these limits. Water resource plans are in state for all but one state, New South Wales, where 2 of 20 plans have been accredited. Water resource plans are critical. They are the legal mechanism through which the states show how they will deliver on the requirements of the Basin Plan at a local scale, how they will deliver the actions and the promises that they made when the plan was established 10 years ago. Now, we've seen 2,100 gigalitres of water return to the environment. That's about 4 Sydney harbours worth. And we're starting to see some of the promising environmental outcomes from this water. According to the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder, during the past 10 years, water for the environment has helped avoid some of the devastating impacts of droughts on the basin's rivers, plants and animals, keeping them alive until good conditions returned. Environmental water has connected rivers after drought in the north, maintaining refuge habitat that has underpinned the recovery we are actually starting to see in the northern areas of the basin. It supported the continued recovery of native fish species since fish deaths several years ago, and native fish species have been spawning in high numbers. During the last drought, almost all of the flows to the Coorong were due to water for the environment recovered under the Basin Plan. Over the past 7 years, water for the environment has supported more than 22,000 kilometres of waterways and inundated more than 370,000 hectares of lakes, wetlands, estuarine ecosystems and floodplains, including 10 Ramsar sites. The water has supported countless waterbird and native fish species. And water for the environment has helped export more than 3.3 million tonnes of salt through the barrages and out to sea. And we're seeing a more coordinated approach to using this water for the environment. A bit over 10 years ago, water for the environment was being used to target specific locations at the time of drought. Today, under the Basin Plan, environmental water holders and the MDBA are working together to better coordinate how they use water to deliver benefits across the river system. It's adaptive water management in action. And in the hot and dry years through the life of the Basin Plan, this water has provided between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the water flowing to the Lower Murray and the Murray Mouth, providing benefits from the top to the bottom of the system. And a river like the Murray dies if it's not connected with the sea. It must connect with the ocean to flush out the sediment and the salt. and failing to do so significantly reduces water quality and, in the case of the Murray, would permanently damage the ecosystems of the lower lakes and Coorong, as well as seriously impacting the health of the entire system. Make no mistake, all of us depend on a healthy river, flushed of its salt and its nutrient load and its sediment. And thanks to Water for the Environment, salt interception schemes and better land management practices, we've seen the basin's salinity target for the Murray River at Morgan in South Australia met every year for the last 13 years. But is it enough? Has enough water been recovered to sustain the Murray-Darling Basin? And are our rivers set up to deliver the water that has been returned to the environment? Sadly, no. Like it or not, our major rivers are now highly regulated. The networks of dams and locks and weirs built over 100 years ago mean that, for the most part, water can be delivered where it's needed, to an irrigator for their crop or to a town for their drinking water. And after 100 years of regulation and control, many of our rivers have been turned into little more than pipelines with one purpose: to deliver water to users. It's a consumptive pattern of flow. More water in the summer, less water in the winter. But a river lives and breathes, and it must connect with its floodplain. And the natural rhythm of nature is what the Basin Plan is trying to replicate, while also minimising the impact on communities. Right now, around 90% of the water used by the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder is delivered in channel, and in some instances this water is still having to be pumped out onto the floodplain. Critical state-led projects to improve supply and ease constraints are delayed, making it harder to achieve the outcomes that basin governments intended and committed to 10 years ago. And despite the progress I've just spoken about, not all the water for the environment has been recovered. It's not what governments signed up to 10 years ago. Much has been achieved, but there's still much to do. So much at stake. The Basin Plan set a benchmark target of returning 2,750 gigalitres of water to the environment. Following the Northern Basin Review in 2018, this amount was reduced to 2,680 gigalitres. And the Basin Plan also sets out a further 450 gigalitres for the environment to be delivered through efficiency measures. And, for the point of clarity, this water is part of the plan, it's part of the Water Act, plain and simple. It's not an up to, it's not an add-on, it's part of the plan. As I touched on earlier, more than 2,100 gigalitres has been returned to the environment and is primarily managed by the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder. Now, to provide flexibility, the Basin Plan included a way to adjust the amount of water that can be taken from our rivers and our groundwater systems. This is known as the SDL adjustment mechanism. Basically, what the state's committed to is to complete a bunch of projects that would allow us to achieve the outcomes envisaged by the Basin Plan, but with less environmental water. In 2017, Basin governments put forward 36 projects. We at the MBDA assessed them and determined that as a package, they would deliver environmental outcomes equivalent to 605 gigalitres of water, essentially keeping 605 gigalitres of water in consumptive use. Until they're up and working as proposed, these SIDLAM projects, as they're known, are like a credit to water users at the expense of the environment. The credit's been banked, but the payment still needs to be delivered, and the payment is in the form of the SIDLAM projects being in operation by the 30th of June 2024. Today, we're releasing our 2022 SIDLAM Assurance Report. It's the fourth such report, consistent with a commitment to be transparent on progress being made by the states in delivering their projects. The volumes in the report are a point-in-time estimate, and only in 2024 will we calculate the new contribution from working projects and incorporate any further progress. But the report establishes clearly that some projects will not be completed by the 30th of June 2024 deadline. Consequently, we are preparing to undertake a reconciliation in 2024, as we are statutorily required to do under the Basin Plan. As it stands, several projects to ease constraints so the river can more easily connect with its floodplain are estimated to need another 5 to 10 years beyond 2024 to be finished. And the New South Wales Government has been clear that the Menindee Lakes Water Saving Project will not support the environmental outcomes and volumetric contribution expected in 2017. Currently, our assessment is that the SIDLAM projects will most likely deliver between 290 and 415 of the 605 gigalitres required as part of the Basin Plan. Put another way, we expect a shortfall of between 190 and 315 gigalitres. This means that the authority will have no choice but to recommend to the Federal Water Minister amended sustainable diversion limits in southern basin catchments. Of course, the actual steps to bridge any expanded water recovery gap will be a decision for basin governments at the time. And, as I mentioned, recovering the 450 gigalitres through efficiency measures is also proving challenging. Just over 4 gigalitres have been delivered, with a further 22.1 gigalitres contracted for delivery. And while achieving the 450 gigalitres by the 2024 deadline will be very difficult, Minister Plibersek has confirmed that all options are on the table for achieving that target. Our role as the MDBA is to advise government on options as requested and how these options may impact on SDLs and to report transparently on progress. Now, these water recovery numbers are not plucked from the air. They were rooted in the best available science and focus on what the environment of the basin needs to be sustainable. Water recovery targets matter, and that is why they are such an important element of tracking the performance of the basin plan. And they are a legislative commitment that basin governments have made. And don't get me wrong, this is tough. It's the pointy end of the plan and it's a watershed moment. And governments must work hard and they must stay the course. They must continue to work together to deliver what is tough for some, but necessary for the nation. They must deliver what they have started, because it's only going to become harder, and you only need to look outside to understand why. Now, there are two certainties as we move into the second decade of the Basin Plan. One is climate change. We know the climate is changing. The CSIRO has developed several plausible scenarios that describe the changing climate on our rivers and our groundwater systems. Under the most probable scenario, rainfall would decrease by 10% by 2050 compared with the historical climate of the basin. River flows could fall by 30%. That's 30% less water in our rivers. The science tells us we face an uncertain future and that managing for more extreme events will be essential. None of us can do the things we have always done in the same way and expect the same results. All of us must continue to adapt if we are to leave a sustainable basin for future generations. The other certainty is we must deal First Nations people into water management in a real and meaningful way. This continent is home to the oldest continuing living culture in the world, and it's something that we should all take pride in as Australians. A culture that has adapted to massive changes in climate over millennia and highly variable water availability, and not only survived but thrived. What we can learn from First Nations people regarding water management, we are only just beginning to conceive. All of us need to work harder to provide a place for First Nations people in water management decision making. We need to rethink how do we incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the way in which we manage water in the basin. And we need to do this in a respectful and culturally appropriate way. And we need to do it for all Australians. This, I see, is the great unfinished business of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Which brings me to the Basin Plan review. In 2026, we will review the Basin Plan. It's a legislated review and it will take a comprehensive look at what's working, what isn't, and what parts of the Basin Plan need to be and should be changed. After all, it's an adaptive plan. Ultimately, it'll be basin governments that make decisions on the future amendments to the plan. Part of our job is to gather the best evidence base and advice to support that decision making. 10 years of lived experience is fundamental to future decision making. There is 10 years of new climate science to consider. There is 10 years of tapping into the collective wisdom and science of our First Nations people. Murray-Darling Basin Plan has its strengths, and yep, it has its weaknesses. The plan is not perfect, but it's the plan we have. It's the plan we, as a nation, committed to. And there is no plan B. The MDBA will work with those who have a stake in a healthy system to build on the strengths and improve the weaknesses, and we'll do it in the national interest. So how can the plan be improved to address future challenges, including climate change? How can the Basin Plan's regulatory framework be simplified? How do we get the best outcomes for all social, cultural, environmental and economic values for the river? How can the Murray-Darling Basin Plan be improved to recognise First Nations values in water management and enhance their involvement? And in addition, we need to consider how the delivery patterns of consumptive water use have changed, as well as how the management of water for the environment has evolved over the last 10 years. We also need to think about how we can integrate water management with other natural resource management activities to achieve strong and sustainable and long-lasting environmental outcomes. Now, water management in the basin, indeed water management anywhere, is based on cooperation. Cooperation between the Commonwealth, the ACT and 4 state governments. Cooperation between communities, First Nations, local governments, and cooperations between irrigators, conservationists and tourism operators. Now more than ever, cooperation and commitment must be the cornerstone to our approach to adaptive water management in the Murray-Darling Basin. When the then Prime Minister John Howard announced the Basin Plan in January 2007, he said, "Tackling Australia's water security is an immense challenge. It requires a comprehensive, bold plan. It requires a commitment of resources and, above all, it requires people to think as Australians above any other parochial identification or consideration." This statement is as true today as it was 15 years ago. The basin's rivers don't stop at the border or indeed at the end of your valley. The Murray-Darling Basin is a connected living ecosystem that supports a myriad of values. All these values hold merit and all of these values matter. And combined, these values form part of our Australian identity. And we mustn't lose sight of the balance between the values that the Basin Plan is endeavouring to strike. As one of the architects of the Basin Plan, previous chair of the MDBA, Craig Knowles, said, "If we get this balance wrong, our environment will tell us. She is the toughest negotiator of all." It's inevitable that communities and governments will need to continue to make hard decisions. As the MDBA, we're committed to gathering the best available evidence to help inform these decisions and sharing what we learn along the way. We've learnt much during the last 10 years in terms of what we do, how we do it, and what we need to do in the future. All governments, the MDBA and the array of communities who depend on our rivers must continue listening and learning and finding ways to do things better. We must keep on adapting. We need to ensure that all interested parties have a seat at the table and are being heard, not just by governments and decision makers, but being heard by each other. Because in my experience, that's when we see transformative change. The MDBA wants to see a resilient Murray-Darling Basin. We want to see a basin that is ready for the communities of the future. Rivers for generations. It's a collective endeavour. Thanks very much.
So you're on TikTok, Andrew?
No, my son is.
Can I just get you spoke there about the shortfall in terms of the state-run projects, which are known as SIDLAM projects. During the recent estimates hearing, I think the officials told us there was a shortfall of about 160 gigalitres working towards that 605 target. Could you please repeat what you think the shortfall is today? And could you please tell us why you think that shortfall is there? Is it because New South Wales hasn't done its share of the work?
There's a few parts to that question, Kath. So in terms of what was put forward in estimates, that was a lower number, and that was an estimate that was made in April 21 by a consultant that was hired by the department. And what we've done since then is gone in and looked at the projects and determined what we think at this point in time. And it's important to remember it is at this point in time, and more progress will inevitably be made. We think between 190 and 315 gigalitres, as we stand today, would be the shortfall. And what we've identified is of the 36 projects, there are around 7 that we've categorised as at high risk. Some of those are constraints projects, so that's about getting water out onto the floodplains. There's projects, Menindee, as I mentioned, and a couple of others in New South Wales. So these are significant projects, and we want to work with the states to see what we can do to get them, but it's going to be a pretty tough ask to get to that point, Kath, yeah. And sorry, the last part of your question was?
Is it New South Wales' fault?
Oh, look, I think the reality... New South Wales is the largest state in the basin, and they've got the largest majority of heavy lifting to do. They have 20 of the the 33 water resource plans. So that's where a lot of the work is being done. But there are projects in other states which will also need to be progressed.
Just before we go to questions from the floor, you touched on the impact of climate change across the basin. This time last year, you were the head of the oil and gas lobby in this country. Today, you're talking about considering the impacts of climate change. You also touched on, I think, more than 70 reports across the basin and this commitment to deliver water that we know the constraints work hasn't been done, so we can't even deliver the water at this stage. Why should anyone who lives in the basin or who has been advocating on behalf of the environment or who's been following these 70 different reports trust you? Why should it be any different now?
Well, I think, I'm here, Kath, and I'm delivering the message very, very clearly that there's more work to do. We have made significant progress, absolutely, and I think we need to recognise and applaud the work that the irrigation communities have done. But our job as the MDBA and my job as the Chief Executive leading this organisation is to make sure that we bring transparency to that progress. And I've spent a career dealing in difficult and contested spaces, and it's difficult when you have a situation where you have competing needs of irrigation, the environment and communities, and I think that's something that I understand, and it's about how do you get parties to the table together. And we talk about the scrutiny of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. I'd like to flip that round the other way. 70 individual reports, a number of parliamentary inquiries, 10 by the Commonwealth Parliament, other independent reports, and still the Basin Plan is here, and no one is saying we should do away with it. So I think, to me, that's testament that the plan is working. The reality is we have more work to do, and we've still got more water that we need to deliver the plan in full. But we are seeing the benefits from that water to the environment, and that's very significant. We are seeing adjustment in communities, and what I've got to try and do in my role is bring transparency to that. We are working hard on climate change in the context of the Basin Plan and a whole raft of other things. But I think it's important that we bring people along on that journey, and that's what I've had a career in, and that's what I'm focused on.
With that, it's over to Mike Foley from the SMH and the Age.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm also a member of the National Rural Press Club, and thank you for your address and your push for the need for greater transparency and your commitment to do that. Global climate scientists, including at the recent COP conference, are warning of carbon emissions are not coming down quick enough to stop escalating impacts of climate change above what is currently forecast. You mentioned the reductions in southeast Australian rainfall that CSIRO has put out there on the agenda. And we're being warned that there's potential for even greater reductions in rainfall, and it's quite apparent to anyone who follows it what 10 years ago was the upper limit of potential impacts has sometimes become the median forecast, and we're actually seeing, 10% reduction in southeast Australian rainfall to date. So my question is, as an independent agency and the leader of that, will you advise the Minister, based on the science, including potentially the need for greater water recovery to deliver the Basin Plan's objectives to restore the river system to health?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I think the first important point is we haven't finished what we started yet. We're 2,100 gigalitres into a 3,200 gigalitre commitment, and we need to see that through. When we developed the Basin Plan in 2012, that was based on the best available science at the time, and as the MDBA, that's a legislative commitment that we have. Over time, the Basin Plan is an adaptive plan, and so we've continued to evolve and adapt, and it will be one of the key focus of the review of the Basin Plan, and indeed that's why we have these 10-year reviews built into the framework for the Basin Plan, so the first being in 2026, and as I mentioned, climate change is a key pillar in that. We're not sitting on our hands waiting for 26. We've got a raft of programs already underway, the Murray-Darling Water for the Environment Research Program that we're working with CSIRO, La Trobe and other universities, a raft of other things, sustainable rivers audit, sustainable yields and the like. So it's about continuing to adapt and evolve the science. I think the important point and it goes to your opening comment, Mike, about transparency, is bringing transparency. As new science is coming on stream, we have to make sure that we're considering that and adjusting the basin plan as we go. And it is an adaptive instrument. I mean, SDLs are looked at every year in terms of what happens, as are water entitlements. But I think we have to continue to evolve. And the good news is that the basin plan has built into it a review mechanism which will allow us to account for that.
So in the interest of transparency and part of that adaptive management, would the MDBA that you lead be prepared to issue that advice that greater water recovery would be needed to deliver on the objectives set out in the Act?
Well, yeah, look, as I said, Mike, I think the first thing is let's get done what we committed to first. So I think it's a bit preemptive to say, well, we need to do more. We haven't yet got what we set out to do. And I think as part of the basin plan review in 2026, we'll look at, is the basin plan adapting in the right way to climate change? And if so, what are the implications of that? And that could be part of that report that we'll put to the Minister.
Jess Malcolm from The Australian.
Jess Malcolm from The Australian. Thanks for your address. The federal budget included an undisclosed amount of funding to buy water entitlements from irrigators in the Murray-Darling Basin. Do you support water buybacks as a way to meet water savings targets? I
think what we do support, Jess, is a sustainable approach to water recovery. Now, the Minister has made it clear that all options are on the table, and that includes purchasing water to do what's called bridge the gap. I think in any exercise to recover water, and we said this in our 2020 evaluation of the basin plan with reference to some of the work of the Sefton review, that we have to be very cognisant of the impact that water recovery is having on communities. As I said in my remarks, some have been positive, some have been negative, and I think it's very important that we make sure we're taking into account the environmental science, the social and economic science to understand the impacts on those communities. So, I think there's a range of options on the table. Ultimately, and this is not dodging your question, it's just being very honest in terms of my role, it is a decision for governments as to how they will recover that water. Our job is to report transparently on the progress of that, but I think we have to look at a range of options, and in doing so, we have to make sure that we're understanding the impacts of all water recovery programs across the basin.
Thanks.
Jamison Murphy from The Land.
G'day, Andrew. Thanks for your speech. A lot of the community anxiety around the plan is around uncertainty about what's going to happen next. So I wanted to squeeze some specific details out of you about the reconciliation process.
Yep.
And when I've broached this topic in the past, the question is often avoided because we don't know the specific details of what or how much water will be short. So just to neatly sidestep that, I'm just going to pick an arbitrary number. So what happens, can you walk us through the process, is if we're short 400 gigalitres across all the targets that we have?
Thanks, Jamison. So the process is set out under the basin plan. So if we as the basin authority consider that there will be a shortfall in those projects, and we've been reporting every 6 months for the last 4 years without putting numbers on it, that it's getting tougher and tougher. And as I say, the first time today we've put an estimate around it. So when we get to 24, and it's actually December 23 where we think that is going to be a shortfall, we will look at those projects that haven't been delivered and estimate what we think that shortfall is. And then we make a recommendation to the Minister. So our job is to say to the Minister, this is what we think that shortfall will be. The question of then what adjustment were to be made to sustainable diversion limits is a question for the Minister and the Parliament. There is then a formula that sits in behind that, and it's very complex, and I don't profess to understand it, but there's a formula that then sits in behind that as to how that adjustment would then be made across South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. So it's very much set out in the basin plan as to how that adjustment, once the number is determined, would be made.
And I'm not sure if you can answer this, but how's that going to look for people on the ground? What's the average farmer going to see from that process?
Yeah, I can't answer it because, we don't know what that number will be.
400, we'll go for
well, I'm not.
just for an example.
Yeah, look,
because otherwise we're just talking in hypothetical for so long.
Yeah, so there's
so much uncertainty.
Sure. So there's a formulaic approach, and we can be very transparent in terms of how that formula is calculated. We do that in terms of the advice we put forward to the Minister, and that would it sort of comes out in reverse. It backs in at what's been delivered versus what needs to be delivered. And that's about as far as my knowledge extends in terms of the detail. But we'd be very transparent in terms of how we determine what the shortfall is, the impact that will be on the states. And that's why we start in December 23 for a reconciliation in June 24. I think the other point it's really important to make here, Jamison, is that our task as the MDBA is to make that recommendation in terms of what it is. The basin plan sets out the process for how the adjustment would be made. The ultimate decision in terms of whether an adjustment will be made and to what extent does rest with the minister.
Just one minister?
It rests with the water minister at the time.
Not the council?
Doesn't rest with us. No, in terms
Sorry,
of...
the water minister's council.
In terms of MINCO, no, that would rest with the federal water minister, yep.
Okay. Simon is from Canberra IQ.
How do you do? Just an observation that the speech and the Q&A so far just shows why people glaze over. It's so complex, so bureaucratic. Anyway, I've got a question about a simple issue that most people can understand, and it's the first time I've asked a question in this place about a sand slug. Now, there's a sand slug slowly moving down the Murray from gold mining and land clearing over the period of wide occupation. It's estimated like a 28k section, 3 million tonnes. You did an early study with 6 options, and only one talks about removing the sand. We're in an era where recycling waste is cool. This sand is waste. What's the problem in terms of recycling it? Is it not useful, the kind of sand that it is? Is the cost of removing it would not be recoverable by selling it? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so it's funny, I was talking to someone the other day and they said, I bet you talk about the sand slug. It's 20 million tonnes overall, so that's about 13 MCGs of sand, so it's significant. Look, the Barmah-Millewa feasibility study, yeah, as you say, it covers 6 options. And the reality will be it has to be a mix of those options in terms of, yes, some dredging, looking at restoring the health of banks. It looks at using alternative infrastructure to move flows around, because if we don't, then the capacity to deliver water through that will decline by about 1,000 megalitres over a 10-year period. So your question in terms of why can't we just go in and sort of take the sand out? Riverine ecology is really, really complex, and so the river has actually adapted to that sand being there over time. So to come in and sort of simply remove it would actually be, remove it in its entirety would also be very, very damaging.
You could remove it over 50 years.
Well, look, it is one of the options that's being looked at, and I think if we have to look at it in the context of it, that's not just the solution. It has to be with other elements, looking at, as I say, moving water with other infrastructure and so on. So it's going to be a combination of those things, but certainly removing some of the sand over time has to be part of that solution. Ultimately, it will. The Barmah-Millewa feasibility study will be presented to MINCO, we think, next February, and we'll have to make a decision as to how to move forward. But it will be part of it, but we have to be very, very mindful of what is a very delicate ecology of the river system that's adjusted to that 20 million tonnes of sand, as you say, over 100 years.
And what about the nature of the sand? Is it usable, or is it a problem?
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
So there'll be a decision on that gosh, it's a heavy agenda.
Well,
program in February.
You've got to turn up and do the work. So yeah, the intention is to present the outcomes of the feasibility study to MINCO in February.
Let's go to Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
G'day, and thanks for your speech. One of the things, barely a day goes past without a Premier, often a New South Wales Premier, jumping up on television and saying, we're going to build a dam and we're going to raise the dam here. Would some of that money be better spent actually slowing the flow? Particularly, you mentioned the Menindee Lakes. Do we need to invest in spending money in those sort of areas to avoid the downstream problems that we've had this year, so that, pardon me, perhaps people are thinking, well, you know, maybe the drought won't occur again. Would this sort of thing actually appease everyone, because everyone can see the point of actually slowing the flow of the river so that it doesn't, you avoid the need for a huge dam?
Well, I can tell you in my 4 months in the job that no matter what you do in water, you can't appease everyone. Look, I think water infrastructure is certainly really, really important, and whatever water infrastructure that is considered being built, I mean, it has to make sure it accords with the right environmental outcomes. It has to make economic sense. It has to make social sense. So it's a delicate equation. From our perspective, when we look at water infrastructure, and our job is to talk to the states around the impacts of water infrastructure. Whatever infrastructure is built has to fit within the confines of the plan. So in terms of if you go and build a storage, it doesn't increase the amount of water you can take from the system. It's just moving water into a different place. Now, ultimately, we'll advise state governments as to what the implications of that are, but it is very much a consideration for them, looking at the economics, the ecology and the environment as to what they do. And it's going to be a range of options in any given situation. The dams that we do have, major dams at the moment, they are very much around storing water. They're not about flood mitigation. So these are difficult decisions that have to be made by state governments. But it doesn't, and I think this is the really important point, it doesn't then increase the overall allocation of water. Whatever happens, whatever is stored in the system still has to fit within the constraints of the basin plan.
So that's the key, to use the water upstream, keep it upstream. Well,
I think it's about using it, in accordance with all of the water resource plans. That's why we have water resource plans on a catchment by catchment basis, and they set out very clearly what the government's commitment to is in terms of maintaining planned environmental water, maintaining water for irrigation and other purposes, and the connectivity. So that's why water resource plans are so important. Yeah.
David Denham from Preview Magazine.
Thank you very much. That was a comprehensive talk you gave there. Well done. For my simple mind, I'm almost drowned in gigaliters. Can you give a percentage of how the water is used? This is my first question, because this one is just to clarify what's going on. I mean, you've got the town usage, irrigation, environment, and there might be other things you might put in there. Could you put that in a percentage?
Yes, it is a tough one, Dave. So where we ended up is the water that's used in the basin on an annual basis is around 10,680 gigalitres. So that's all water that's taken out and used for agriculture and consumptive use. And then of that 10,680, 3,200 is water for the environment, of which 2,100 has currently been recovered. Don't get me into the actual flows into the basin, you'll fry your mind with numbers, but that's 10,680 of that 3,200, okay. Or 860 rather, 10,860, 3,200 for the environment.
Okay, yeah, I suppose so. Now the other thing is that...
Trust me, it's in the plan.
I'd like them in percentages, but never mind.
So you're talking, well, what's that, roughly 30%.
The other... How many? Okay. Okay, now the next... Yeah.
Right, we've just got a couple
the next
more
one
questions.
is there's a big time frame difference in what the agreement is between the states as to how you use the water, and the actual weather itself changes much more rapidly. So it might be over 2 or 3 years, whereas the others. How do you manage that in the plan?
So it's a great question. So I mean, when the plan was established in 2012, what it did was it took 114 years of climate data and then modelled various scenarios against that. And the plan is adaptive, so it changes over time. And then each year, in terms of allocations, water is allocated to the environment and to consumptive users across each year, and that changes every year. And then we have a built-in process of review. 2026 being the first of those where we'll go in and look at that. And I think, picked up Michael's comment over there, you're right. I mean, in terms of flows that actually come into the basin in terms of rainfall, it's 33,000 gigalitres or thereabouts a year, and then there's that 10,860, which is consumptive use.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problems.
It's almost like talking to a calculator. A lot of numbers. Lucy Barber from the ABC and President of the National Rural Press Club.
Andrew, thank you so much for your speech, and thank you for coming to the Press Club this early in your tenure at the MDBA. Given you're saying that the unfinished business in the plan for you personally is that our First Nations people should be included more in knowledge of water management and water management itself, how practically, or can you give us practical examples of how that should be happening or how you'd like to see it happening? Yeah. And given that you've cited that as part of the unfinished business, but also factoring in climate change as well and developments around that issue over the past decade, is that you suggesting that this plan in its current form is not fit for purpose?
I think in terms of sort of First Nations involvement, I think, Lucy, there's a number of steps involved. I mean, it's making sure we get the perspective. So, on the board of the MDBA, Renee Woods, very proud Narri First Nations elder, is on the board. So, we always make sure that there's that perspective. So that's piece one. The second is the consideration of First Nations views amongst a range of other factors in the development of water resource plans, and it's not determinative, but it is under I think it's part 10, I believe, of the Basin Plan, that consideration of First Nations views and input there. So in the development of water resource plans, that's another part of it. I think in terms of the learnings that we have, it's taking real life examples like the project at Guyani down near Hay. It's a Narri project where the Narri Nation has taken over a conglomeration of farms and returned that to sort of environmental use. And that, I mean, I've been there and it is unbelievable in terms of what they've been able to achieve. So I think it's taking examples like that and learning from it. And it's also in the process of, as we consult going forward with the Basin Plan Review, our current chair of the Basin Consultative Committee, Phil Duncan, is here, and Phil's a very proud First Nations man as well. So it's about how do we bring those different perspectives in right across the board. And I do believe, and I don't yet want to preempt or even necessarily fully understand what it will mean for the Basin Plan Review going forward, but we've put down 4 priorities, and one of those is how do we better understand and better incorporate First Nations values and views into that. Now, does that mean changes right through the Basin Plan? Does it mean add-ons? Look, I don't know, but certainly from my leadership perspective of the MDBA, it's something that I'm very, very passionate about, and I want to make sure that we get it right. What right looks like right now, I don't know, but I think we've got examples of where really good work is being done. I think we're doing much, much better in the consultation processes that we're engaging, and we have to be inclusive. And just as an aside, I was talking to a First Nation elder just the other day about this sort of issue, and I said, mate, this is really tough. I said, what have I got to do? Have I got to go out and talk to all 40 nations? He went, absolutely, son. So it really starts there, and I think it's about having that inclusive conversation, and we're also learning the science as well in terms of managing that. So that will be part of is part of the Basin Plan Review as we go forward.
And so, putting reviews aside for a second, what's your gut feeling based on everything you've learnt so far in the role, everyone you've spoken to? Do you think the plan is going to achieve what it has set out to achieve: healthy river systems, sustainable agriculture?
I think we can do more. I do think we can do more, and that's step one, is actually delivering the plan that the state signed up to and committed to. I think that's step one. I think we need to think about how to be more inclusive. How do we make sure that we're reflecting the things I set out? So there's definitely more work to be done, and I think the good news there is that's why the process of the Basin Plan and Water Act has a review step built in, because we know a lot more now than we did 10 years ago, and it behooves us to make sure that we incorporate that knowledge going forward. And I think it's brilliant that there is actually a set point in time that says we've got to stop, look, listen, incorporate, and then move forward. And I think the other important point here, just to close with, Lucy, is a lot of people think, the Basin Plan's done in 24 or whatever. It's not. The Basin Plan goes on. The Basin Plan continues to live, and we've got a process of review every 10 years. It's just the first set of targets is 24. So there's a real opportunity for us to continue to do better as we go forward, and I'm very, very committed to seeing that we do that.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Kath.
Thanks, Lucy. What a great place to leave it. Andrew McConville, thank you so much for your time today. Please accept as a gift a membership to the club here, the National Press Club and the National Rural Press Club. And please join me in thanking Andrew McConville.